Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And we are about to begin our sixth season in this playthrough. It is 2029 here in fantasy baseball world. And the season is about to get underway. We've got three primary goals this season from ownership. We need to play 500 ball this season, and we need to increase fan interest. I guess that's really only two primary goals if I could add and do very simple first grade addition. I was looking at the fact that we had already acquired Colt Keith, so we've achieved that goal already 2 years early. Fan interest, we're probably not going to get to make too much progress. The big boost we got this offseason was bringing Colt Keith on board. If we play pretty well this year and we maybe add a player or two that are popular near the deadline, we can probably get that number up a bit. If it's a rough season for us and we're a 65 to 70 kind of win team, there's probably going to be some natural attrition in that number, but hopefully we'll finish off at least 5 ahead of where we were a year ago with that 38. And then the key goal is to play 500 ball, and I don't even want to say cautiously optimistic, although I know got some comments to the last couple episodes about this team, really isn't going anywhere. Why are you making some of the short-term moves that you're making, essentially? I disagree with that. I think that we've improved this team a lot from last season. Now, granted, that's improving a 73-win team, so there's still a lot of work to do to get this team to 500. But I think that it's the best team that we've ever had on paper, and I think we're going to play 500 ball, and I think we're going to be pretty competitive. I don't see this as a 90-win team, just to be clear, but I think we're going to be 500 this season, and I think heading into the last week of the season, we're probably still going to be alive in the race for the wild card. Taking a look at our lineups, a few key additions this offseason. Brought Agustin Ramirez on board in a trade, and he's going to be platooning at catcher with Drake Baldwin. A couple of new infielders. Charlie Condon, who we picked up in a trade with Cleveland, is a first base /DH/corner outfielder for us. And then, of course, Colt Keith was the major acquisition. Traded away the controversial Hidero Endo to bring Keith on board. Keith certainly has been an all-star caliber player for the last few seasons and is off to a very strong start in his career. Not as good defensively as Endo, but a much more productive bat with a 132 WRC plus a year ago. Certainly we would expect that to regress a bit, playing half of his games in Oakland, but still think he's going to be a more productive offensive player than Mr. Endo is. And if Keith is not, that's going to be a big loss for us. Also added a couple of new outfielders this year. Chase DeLauder, like Condon, picked him up in a trade with Cleveland. And then we signed Byron Buxton to be a center fielder for us this year. Buxton, despite the fact that he is coming off a 30-homer, 100 ribby year, has regressed a bit this offseason. He was wrecked physically when we signed him, but it looks like his defense is deteriorating also. Still think he can be a pretty useful bat for us against left-handed pitching, but with that 40 contact against righties and lower gap and home run power, I guess he doesn't have lower home run power, but lower gap power against righties, probably not going to be as effective there. And we're actually going to still start Luis Lara every day as our center fielder, because although Buxton seems to have regressed defensively, Luis Lara's ratings are as high as they've ever been. So hopefully he's only 24 years old. The hope is that he still gets to be a more effective offensive player. He went from a 75 to an 88 WRC plus a year ago. If he can add another 13 points this year, he'll be a slightly above average offensive player. And with the defense that he brings, still holding out hope that he could be a pretty useful offensive player for us, and certainly a useful defensive player. So as we think about our 26-man roster and our 13 position players, 8 of them are holdovers, and I think the 5 that we've brought on board should help us improve. Agustin Ramirez should definitely give us more production out of the right-handed hitting portion of our catcher platoon. Colt Keith, as we've talked about, should give us more consistent offense than we got out of Hidero Endo. And the hope is that Charlie Condon, Chase DeLauder, and Byron Buxton give us more offensive production kind of out of those first base, corner outfield, DH platoon roles that we've been rotating several people through over the years. And then we look at the rest of this team. Everyone who's a holdover is in their mid-20s, essentially. So should not see really any significant regression in the 8 holdovers that we have. And it certainly is conceivable that some of the younger players on this team, Luis Lara, Brian Rincon, could actually show some improvement from what they did offensively a year ago. So on paper, I believe this team is better offensively than it was a year ago. And we had a very good defense a year ago. The only spot where I feel we're going to have any regression defensively is at third base. Colt Keith doesn't have the same range as Hidero Endo, who's got 60 range, but I think Keith is a competent defensive third baseman. Certainly will not be as good defensively as Endo, but my hope is that the increased offensive production makes up for that, and I wouldn't think that a less good defensive third baseman is going to turn us from one of the top defensive teams in the American League to one of the bottom defensive teams in the American League, but you never know. That's why we play the virtual baseball games. And before we take a look at our pitching staff, one thing to report on. We mentioned that Jesus Soto was injury pending at the end of the last episode. Got the worst news possible there, a torn flexor tendon in his elbow, and the lefty specialist is going to be out for the entire season. So that did kind of make it easier for us to put this eventual pitching staff together. 2 key additions to the starting rotation, the left-handers Jackson Ferris and Nick Lodolo, both of whom we traded for. Kyle Bradish, Mason Miller, and Bubba Chandler will be back in the rotation. The bullpen, Chase Lee is going to be our closer again. He throws the softest of anyone on our team, but he was competent as a closer for us a year ago. Not great, but we're going to put Mason Black, who we picked up this offseason in a trade with the Giants, into a stopper role. He, until we made the trade for Lodolo, was positioned to be a starter for us this year. Kind of like Black stuff as a reliever. He's got pretty good stamina, normal injury proneness, even though he is day-to-day with hamstring soreness right now that we're going to sit him out for the first couple days. Like that he's a ground ball pitcher that throws in the mid to high 90s, and would love to get 100, 120 innings out of him as a stopper. Ben Leeper and Emmett Sheehan back as setup men. 2 new additions, Patrick Sandoval and Brian Wu, were both guys that we signed to minor league contracts coming out of spring training, and they will make the team. Mitch Spence, back from injury, will be in a long relief role, and Bennett Souza, the lefty specialist, will also help us in middle relief. So think that this can be a pretty interesting rotation, and we'll get into Nick Lodolo now. Pretty negative reaction from a few viewers about the trade that brought him on board. As I said, I think this team can be a 500 team and competing for a wild card spot this year. And I think that Lodolo, with what he brings to the table, above average stuff, average movement, a bit above average control, 4-pitch arsenal, including a excellent curveball and a very good fastball, above average sinker, and a change that's fine. pretty good stamina, and I think his lefty throwing will play reasonably well in Oakland. I think he's going to have a pretty solid year for us. Obviously, I wouldn't have traded for him if I didn't think that. But I know some of you are kind of viewing him as a replacement level pitcher. And a guy with 60 stuff, 50 stamina, and a 4-pitch arsenal of above average pitches who's not below average in movement or control. To me, that's not a replacement level pitcher. I agree that, over the course of his career, he's certainly been a average-ish pitcher in terms of his ERA plus and his FIP minus, but he still has put up WAR of basically 3 or higher in 3 of the last 4 seasons. Granted, he's coming off the worst season of his career when he led the NL in losses, but I think he's going to benefit from our good defense. I think he's going to benefit a bit from the park that he's going to play in. And I think he's going to have a year much more similar to what he did in 2027 than what he did in 2026 and 2028 in terms of his statistics. There was concern, also with the international amateur free agent money that I did have to give up to bring him on board. It was $750,000. My thought on that was that we had already spent $3.75 million to bring Mr. Palomares on board as our primary acquisition of the IAFA period. When I looked offline at the other better top-end prospects we had been talking about, the $1.95 million we had left was not going to get us anywhere close to getting any of those players. And as I said, I think Lodolo can help us win this year. Is he a $9 million pitcher? I hope so. We'll find out. We'll see what kind of WAR he puts up for us. But it's not a long-term commitment. The criticism that I have made of the move that hasn't necessarily come up from the viewers, but my regrets about potentially ending up with Lodolo are just that I think if we had perhaps been more aggressive a month or so earlier in the offseason, let's say late December, early January, when we were coming out of the winter meetings and the Rule 5 draft, we might have ultimately had better ways to spend the extra money that we had than Lodolo. So there is part of me that's kicking myself a little bit for not being that aggressive. That said, when you think about the guy that we were probably most likely to get aggressive with, it would have been Jack Sawinski of the Yankees, and you never know what would have happened if we had brought him into our organization, but he broke a bone in his elbow right at the start of spring training, and he's out for the year. And you look at the 6-year, $82 million contract that he got with the Yankees. If we had offered him a similar deal, it would have likely become a pretty painful contract for us. And if he had a similar fate this spring training and ended up missing a big chunk of the year or all of the year for us, that would have been a very significant loss for us. So appreciate the different perspectives on Lodolo. We'll see what he ends up doing for us this year. But with the way our finances look, I wanted to ensure that we spent the money on somebody. I do agree with the point that was made that he's probably not going to be someone that we end up making a qualifying offer to. I think if he has a monster year, there is some chance that we can make a QO to him, but it's not a 0 probability that we'll end up getting draft pick compensation in return, but I think it is an extremely low probability. But we gave up some ephemeral IAFA money, and we gave up a few players who weren't in our long-term plans to bring them on board. So I still think it's going to be a decent rental for us, and I think we're in a fine position financially. You can see we've got about $3 million to potentially spend here. Our payroll is just below $60 million, lowest budget and lowest payroll in the game. But we've increased our scouting. and we've increased our player development significantly compared to where they ended a year ago. So those should be positive things for us. And then given that we've got the third pick in the draft this year, I did want to put extra money into the draft budget. Not enough that it's going to let us go overbid for multiple early rounds in the draft, but what I think this budget will allow us to do is even last year with the second overall pick, there were a couple of really interesting and high-priced high school prospects that we just didn't think we could play for financially. The same thing happened to us a few years ago when we had the opportunity to pick Joe Edwards at 4th, and we went in a different direction because he was looking for so much money. In putting this kind of money into the draft budget will hopefully allow us to take just about anybody we want with the third overall pick, regardless of what they're looking for, without messing up the next few rounds of the draft. We'll have to watch our money carefully in the second, third, and fourth and fifth rounds, but having several $1 million, $5 million actually, over what our baseline should be, certainly will give us the flexibility that we can't use. We can't afford this guy as an excuse with the third pick in the draft. So hopefully we'll be able to come out of the draft with exactly who we want. And at worst, the guy that we think is number 3 on the board, and hopefully someone who's our first or second choice. So although I am optimistic about this team, the prognosticators are not. They see us at 76 and 86, 17 games out in the division, tied for third with the Astros. That would be a very small amount of progress from a year ago, but certainly not what I am expecting or thinking is going to happen with this team. We'll see what happens with a 4.05 ERA. They see us as having one of the better pitching staffs in baseball. 654 runs scored would still be one of the worst offenses in the American League. I think we can have a better offense than that. And honestly, I think our pitching can maybe be a little better than they think as well. So I think they're wrong. I think those of you who think we're not going to be 500 this year are wrong as well. And we'll start finding out in this episode and the next several episodes of this series. And one final thing before we get going, we have taken a look at the waiver wire. Several borderline interesting players out there. We've only put in a claim on one player, and it's actually a guy that I don't think we've got a spot for on the Major League roster at this point. We'll talk about it in 3 days if it goes through. But I think if we get him on board, barring an injury over the next couple of days, we are probably just going to try to waive him as well and hope that no one claims him. He's making the Major League minimum, so we're happy to pay that to him, to have him as part of our organization. But I don't see a spot on the roster for him as of today. And we won our first 2 games of the season against the Rangers before dropping the third game of the year yesterday. Try to take the series in Texas to get the season off to a good start today. We did have our waiver claim go through. Roderick Arias from the Boston Red Sox organization. As I mentioned, a guy who's making the Major League minimum, hasn't really gotten a full shot in Boston. 112 at-bats where he hit a .179 a year ago in 2027. Actually, 2 years ago at this point. Spent all of last year in Portland and Worcester. But like the fact that he's a switch-hitting middle infielder who's competent defensively, and the bat doesn't look like it's going to be a complete embarrassment, we are at the point where Brian Rincon next year is going to be making some pretty significant money in arbitration. So I'm not sure whether he's a long-term member of the team. I think Cameron Collie is also going to be eligible for arbitration. So I think Arias is a guy who could certainly be in the mix as a cheap middle infielder for us a year from now. I don't have a specific spot for him in the organization. So we are going to immediately try to put him onto the AAA roster. We've got to obviously place him onto the secondary roster first. And then we will go ahead and waive him and see if maybe nobody accepts him, puts in a claim on him. It's very likely that nobody will because we got the claim on him. I'm guessing there wasn't a ton of competition. As I said, I don't mind spending $740,000 on him this year, given that I think he could be a useful utility infielder for us a year from now. We'll see whether anyone else wants him. And we did end up taking the fourth game of the season opening series at Texas. So good start for Oakland. Certainly winning 3 out of 4 on the road against a divisional rival is the way we want this season to begin. You can see our old buddy Joe Edwards here, who hopefully if there's a Joe Edwards in this year's draft, we'll be able to get him at the third selection, even if he's making crazy money. Had a solid rookie year a year ago. Profile certainly suggests he's going to be a pretty useful major league player. Has 2 doubles already this year, even though the batting average is just $167 in a very small sample size for Razor Edwards. And unfortunately, the Mets claimed Roderick Arias, so he was more popular than we had hoped. So we will end up losing him. As I mentioned, the waiver wire this year wasn't incredibly interesting to us, but thought that Arias was a guy that I wouldn't mind stashing in AAA, but just didn't see a spot for him on the 26-man roster. Colt Keith dealing with some knee inflammation, but still off to a monster start for us with 3 homers and 7 ribbies through his first 5 games in Oakland. Rincon's our second baseman. Muncy is our utility infielder. Collie's at short. And then Condon and Soderstrom are both kind of first base, corner, outfield DH types. So Muncy would have been the guy that we had to let go if we had went for Arias. They're similar players. The bats on both look like they could be borderline useful. Muncy is pretty good in the clubhouse, which I liked. Not quite the same range as Arias, but they're similar players. I like that Muncy, as I said, is a good influence in the clubhouse, and I like that his eye is a little bit better. And Muncy is also a guy who was out of option years, so we would have had to put him through waivers if we had put Arias onto the 26-man roster. So the ultimate decision was to stick with the guy that we know in Max Muncy rather than the player that we do not know in Roderick Arias. And in probably the least surprising news of this young season, in the least surprising news, we've taken our first 2 series of the years after losing the first game against KC, came back and won the next 2, so off to a nice 5-2 start here in the very early going. But even less surprising than us being off to a good start is Byron Buxton with his wrecked injury proneness, now day-to-day with a strained oblique for 2 weeks. Minimal impact on everything, but given that he's really only a guy who's in our lineup against left-handed pitching, we are going to put him right on the shelf so this doesn't turn into anything that destroys his entire season for us. And if you were wondering before we put Buxton onto the IL, off to a nice start, got 2 doubles and 4 ribbies in his first 12 at-bats of the season as a platoon player for us. But if he can put up a 125 WRC plus for us this year and a couple hundred at-bats, primarily against left-handed pitchers, could be a pretty interesting player for us. And with the injury to Mr. Buxton, we have promoted Chris Bryant. You may remember we thought about signing him this offseason. We made him a major league contract to try to take advantage of his extreme popularity, which he refused because we would not promise him a starting gig. And he ended up signing with us as a minor league free agent. So he was in AAA for us, where he, not surprisingly, was incredibly productive. But think that he will hopefully give us a respectable bat against left-handed pitching while Buxton is out. Similar to Buxton, he's wrecked physically. We did get no boost at all to our fan interest back when we picked him up. So I'm going to absolutely lose it if when we have to move him off the roster a few weeks or a few months from now, we take a huge hit to fan interest, given that we got no benefit from him. It may push me to just quit OOTP entirely if that happens. Hopefully that won't be the case, but the fan interest metric is always a pet peeve of mine at this point because it works so clunkily. And if we didn't get any benefit from bringing him on board and he destroys our fan interest when we move on from him, I'm going to likely be lying in the corner of a room in the fetal position sobbing when that happens. But in the meantime, we are off to a good start, and I think hopefully Bryant can help us continue that good start over the next few weeks while Mr. Buxton is convalescing. And for the first time in a few seasons, our A's are actually off to a good start. Just took our third straight series, sweeping the Rangers. You may remember that we have had some brutal starts in the months of March and April and May over the past few seasons. Put this team into a huge hole. We've generally been a 500-ish team over the last 3 or 4 months of the season, each of the last couple years. Who knows how the rest of this year is going to go? Maybe we're just going to completely fall apart in August and September and still end up, kind of in that 70 to 80 win treadmill that we've been on for the first 5 years of this playthrough. But it's at least a small benefit to not feel like we are completely out of the division by the time we get to mid-April. And it was certainly a much rougher week for our Oakland A's here. We lost 2 out of 3 in Seattle, and then we lost 3 out of 4 on the road in Detroit. We're home for this next week with games against the Tampa Bay Rays as well as the Arizona Diamondbacks, and hopefully we can get ourselves right there. Still, if you told me we'd be 10-7 on April 16th, I would have been very content with that number, but would certainly hope that we can play a little better over these last 2 weeks of the month of April, given that we've only got 3 games left on the road for the entire month. And the latest week was a 500 week, which is kind of about where we would expect most of our weeks to be. We lost 2 out of 3 against Tampa, so that was a 3rd consecutive series loss for us before bouncing back to take 2 out of 3 against Arizona. So 13-10 here heading into the final week of April. We did just get some good news. Tyler Soderstrom was the AL Player of the Week, 526, 2 homers, and 5 ribbies. Disappointingly, given the 13-10 start that we are having this year, we've already lost a point in fan interest. You can see attendance quickly trending in a negative direction. Given that we're off to a pretty solid start, that's disappointing, but it is what it is. And we lost 2 out of 3 on the road to the Angels, but that was by far not the worst news that we experienced. Cameron Collie, once again, a significant injury, torn PCL, going to be out for about 9 months. So Collie was actually hitting as well as he's ever hit in the majors this year, 268 average, over 82 at-bats. But just like 2027 and 2028, injury going to severely disrupt his season this year. As I mentioned, he's potentially arbitration eligible next year, set to be making about $3.6 million. As much as I love his glove and as much as I like the progress he made with his bat this year, he's already fragile physically. Who knows what it's going to look like coming back from that injury. But you can see that every year it's kind of been something. Torn PCL this year, ruptured MCL that kept him out last year, broken bone in his elbow in 2026 that kept him out at the beginning of the 2027 season, and then a hyperextended elbow that impacted him after that. So 3 pretty serious injuries for Mr. Collie over the last 36 months, and this one could conceivably mean that he has played his last game in Oakland. So when life gives us lemons, we will try to make lemonade. The loss of Collie will allow us to promote Hideki Arakawa. You may remember we signed him to a minor league deal with a major league option, so we were getting dangerously close to the 30-day deadline where he could opt out of the contract. He was not particularly impressive in AAA Las Vegas, hitting just .247 with a 72 WRC plus. But with that 70 range and an above average error, arm, and turn double play rating, he's going to become our shortstop for the time being. We'll see how he can hit at the major league level. Signed him to that $1 million contract, so he is now on the books for that. Buxton is also now healthy, and we have promoted Buxton. So what that means, of course, is that we have waived and DFA'd Mr. Bryant. He was not particularly impressive, hit .263 in 19 at-bats. Every hit that he had was a single, scored 1 run, no homers, no ribbies, only walked once. So he put up a 59 WRC plus for us. Can't imagine anyone is going to claim him, so we're probably going to need to release him in 7 days, assuming that he will not accept an assignment to AAA. And after losing that series with the Angels, we just dropped the first game of the final homestand of April against Toronto, so we're sitting here at just 14-13, and once again, that's not the worst news. Colt Keith going to be out with plantar fasciitis for about 3 weeks. He is doing everything offensively that we would have hoped that he would. 292 average, 8 homers, and 25 ribbies through his first 27 games in Oakland. He's put up a 163 WRC plus for us, so certainly losing him for 3 weeks is going to leave a big hole in our offense. And with that unfortunate injury to Colt Keith, another blast from the past, Ketel Marte, who we signed as a minor league free agent right when the season was getting underway, was with us a year ago, had him in AAA this year where he was very productive, and we'll see if he can give us a little bit more offense this season than he did a year ago. It's going to definitely weaken our defense. We're going to have to play Tyler Soderstrom at third base against righties. Max Muncy will slide into the third base slot against lefties, and Marte will become our everyday first baseman for the next couple of weeks. Certainly not optimal. Certainly at this point, wish that Roderick Arias transaction had gone through, because with all of the injuries to our infielders, could certainly use a player like that right now, but those are the breaks. And the hits keep coming. Mitch Spence, the reliever, with a strained forearm, 1 to 2 week, moderate impact on his throwing. Certainly not going to push things with a pitcher who's already fragile. Spence has actually been solid this year after pitching just 2 games a year ago. And we've got depth in the farm system, but certainly the back end of our bullpen, I would say, is not as strong as it has been in previous seasons. And certainly the loss of Soto and now Spence for a while is not going to help that. And we're going to promote Eric Silva to take over that long relief and mop-up role. A guy who we picked up in a trade almost 2 years ago with Miami right before the trade deadline. Was kind of a throw-in, just some organizational depth for us. 4-0 record with a 3.46 ERA in AAA this year. 26 years old, making his major league debut. Unlikely that he is a big part of our future, but figured it's worthwhile with the injury to Mr. Spence to at least give Silva his first opportunity at the major league level. And unfortunately, we ended up losing the last series of the month of April, lost 2 out of 3 to Toronto. So after that scintillating 8-2 start, feeling real good about the team, and we actually extended it to 9-2. We've been pretty bad since then with a 6-12 record, but we still are above 500 as the month of April ends, which is a very rare situation for this team to be in. Second place in the division, 3.5 behind the Mariners. Tyler Soderstrom hitting .337. He was, of course, Player of the Week not that long ago. Third in the American League in batting average. He's the only guy on our team who's on any of the leaderboards. Taking a look at team statistics 1 month into the season, we've actually gotten a bit unlucky. 15-14 record should actually be 17-12 according to the math. We're middle of the pack in the American League, 6th in runs scored, so much better offensively than we have been in previous seasons. And also middle of the pack, 6th in runs allowed. But honestly, if you're top 6 in runs scored, top 6 in runs allowed, when all is said and done, probably going to be certainly competitive to be in the playoff race, and would certainly think that we should be on our way to a 500 season, which is a significant goal that we have this year. So nothing in the first month of the season suggests that we won't be able to do that. Don't love that Cameron Collie is now gone for the year in addition to Jesus Soto. Hopefully we'll have Spence and Colt Keith back in the not too distant future. Keith especially is going to be a very important asset to us this year if he can remain healthy. While we're talking about Keith, I promised people I'd give updates on Endo. So let's see how the start of his career in Detroit is going after he was the primary asset that we used to acquire Colt Keith. And he has been much more productive getting away from Oakland. 248 batting average, 112 WRC plus, 8 homers, and 23 ribbies. Has still struck out 52 times in his first 105 at-bats. And if you remember what he did with us in Oakland a year ago, he got off to a very good start in April as well, and then kind of struggled more and more across the course of the season. But certainly a nice start to the 2029 season for Endo. Maybe this will be one of the trades that works out well for both teams, because other than the plantar fasciitis, I'm very pleased with what we've gotten out of Colt Keith over the first month of this 2029 season. And the month of May, not off to a good start. We lost 2 out of 3 against Boston and just dropped the first game of our series against the Astros. So we've already fallen to below 500. Chris Bryant will not accept the demotion to Las Vegas. So unfortunately, it is time for us to release Mr. Bryant. Fortunately, it does not appear that had any impact on the fan interest, so you can avoid me screaming and crying about the fan interest metric for at least one more episode at this point. We've actually gotten a point back from where we had gone. Don't really know why, because we are not playing as well as we were earlier, but I'm not going to complain about that. And with the record under 500, the complaining has begun. Patrick Sandoval, who we signed to a minor league contract back in March, is complaining that he's a starting pitcher and not a role player. Has been solid for us with a 3.20 ERA, 21 strikeouts over 19 and 2/3 innings. Taking a quick look at the pitching staff, and some of you will love the fact that Lodolo is off to a poor start for us. Kyle Bradish certainly reverting towards the mean following a brilliant year last year where he led the league in earned run average. Jackson Ferris off to a nice start. Mason Miller kind of doing typical Mason Miller things. And Bubba Chandler, although he's 0-1, that 3.51 ERA is on the strong side for him. Still early as far as I'm concerned to make a significant move, and quite honestly, if we were going to promote someone into the rotation, it would not be Sandoval, it would be Mason Black, who I think is a higher quality pitcher than Sandoval, particularly with the excellent stuff that he has, although that will be tamped down, I think, to a 60 if he goes back into the rotation. But Black has done exactly what we would have hoped for him in the stopper role with a 0.92 ERA over 29 and a third innings. You can see for the most part things are going pretty well with the bullpen. Silva, not good in his first outing. Bennett Souza has not been good in very limited time. And Emmett Sheehan, not good as well. But otherwise, the bullpen has been pretty solid, including both Sandoval and Wu, who were important acquisitions for us at discount prices as we got close to the start of the season. And the month of May has unfortunately been rough for us, although we have won 3 of our last 4, but we've slipped to 20 and 24. Still second place, but 4 games behind in the division. Good news is we just got Mitch Spence back, so we were able to send Silva back down to AAA. And much more importantly than that, Colt Keith is now healthy and well. Kettle Marte, since we brought him on board, has hit 234, but he does have 4 homers and 9 ribbies and 64 at-bats, so he's been more productive offensively than he was a year ago. That said, his roster spot could certainly be in jeopardy with Keith now healthy and well. And fortunately, getting Colt Keith back in the lineup means good things. We just took a 4-game series sweeping the Yankees, so that gets us back to 500 on the year. Long road trip ahead of us to finish this month of May at Baltimore for 3, at Toronto for 3, and then we go to Minnesota for 4 against the Twins. So certainly will be tough to have at least a 5-5 record in 10 games on the road, but we'll find out how we do to finish up this month of May before we finish up this episode. And one of the nice things about baseball is that you never know what's going to happen. The team's been playing better since Colt Keith came back, and even though it was a road trip, we ended up having a 6-4 record in that 10-game road trip. We took the series in Baltimore 2 out of 3, took the series in Toronto 2 out of 3, and then ended up splitting 4 games in Minnesota. So as we sit here on June 1st, we are 30 and 28. So certainly kind of in line with what we hoped this team would do. We're only half a game behind in the division, tied with the Astros for second, just behind the Mariners. Tyler Soderstrom having a big year, leading the AL with a 331 average, tied for second with 48 ribbies, third in the league with a 979 on base percentage. Taking a look at our team statistics here, and at 30 and 28, we've actually gotten incredibly unlucky. We should be 35 and 23 according to the numbers, so hopefully that's a positive sign for this team going forward. After the 500 April, we were a game above 500 in May, just like we were in that abbreviated month of March. Offense, much better, ranked third in the American League in runs scored at this point. And you can see we're in the top half of the league in every offensive category except walks, where we're tied for ninth. And we're not a particularly proficient team on the base paths. Defensively, we are the number one team in the American League, and we're second in the AL in runs allowed. So honestly, third in runs scored, second in runs allowed should add up to better than a 30-28 record, and we certainly see that in the Pythagorean expectations for us this year. Take a real quick look at the pitching staff. Lodolo continues to struggle with that 5.25 ERA for us. Ferris and Miller have been okay. Bradish, okay. Bubba Chandler, really good. Chaseley and Mason Black both not pitching quite as well as they were to start the year, but still having solid seasons. And otherwise, the pitching has gotten better out of the bullpen, so feeling decent about how things have gone. We'll check in and see what Keith has done at this point, and he's continued to be productive since he got back. 302 batting average, 13 homers and 44 ribbies in just 41 games, 168 WRC plus, and a 2 WAR, despite the fact that he's missed 3 weeks. Looks like he's missed 17 games, if I can do some simple subtraction. And, of course, checking in on Keith. Let's check in on Mr. Endo before the endo of this episode. And Endo, similar to last year, the batting average is dropping down to 227. He does have 14 homers and 39 ribbies, so the production in terms of the power remains there. 90 strikeouts and 198 at-bats. It looks conceivable that he could top that sickly 252 strikeouts he had for us a year ago. And he's down to a 101 WRC plus, although the OPS plus is still pretty strong, probably largely driven by all those home runs that he has hit. So I'm sure Detroit is content with what Endo is doing. We're very pleased with what Colt Keith has done, particularly if he's able to remain healthy the rest of the way. So we're off to a decent start. Wanted to have this team above 500 and thought it could be above 500, and thus far it is. And I'm feeling even better about the fact that we've done that, having lost our starting shortstop for the year in Cameron Collie, and having lost 3 weeks from our best player, Colt Keith. Obviously, Collie won't be back, but hopefully having Keith in the lineup will keep this team scoring more runs than we typically have in the first several years of this playthrough. And in our next episode, we'll find out how this team does as we head towards the midway point of the season, do our mid-season review of where this team stands, and also start checking in somewhat more depth as to what our options may be with the third pick in the upcoming draft, which is just about a month and a half away at this point. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.